welcome to the Religion and Popular Culture podcast, where we talk about religion, popular culture, and everything in between. I am Vivian Asimos, and I am joined, as always, with the lovable Alan Thomas. Alan, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm very happy to be lovable. And to be loved.
You are loved.
What a wonderful world. How are you, Vivian?
I'm good. I'm settled into our new house in Salisbury. And I am near some train tracks, so hopefully those will be edited out, but just in case you hear trains, that is not on your end, most likely. That is on my end, lovely listeners. But yeah, it's good, settled in. I got my plants up behind me.
Gotcha.
I got 4 of them in shot of my Zoom camera. How amazing is that?
And how did the plants cope with the move?
Not well. Our movers actually crushed them. So, this guy behind me, which is a Monstera adonzi for those listening at home, it's got holes in the leaf and they ripped it. So some of the leaves just are now falling off rather than having lovely holes. They just made one giant rip. Poor guys. But they're doing well now. They've been watered and positioned in light, and some of them have been fed. So they should be okay.
What more can a plant ask for?
Yeah, so they'll recover.
They will. They'll be strong plants.
But what my plants particularly enjoy is the fact that it's not as hot as it used to be. It's coming to cool off.
As we're heading into Spooktober.
It's Spooktober, everyone!
Yeah.
Ooh.
I wonder if this will have some sort of effect on the topics that we discuss in the coming weeks.
Who knows?
Who knows? It's a very spooky time.
Under no relation, we're talking about Satanism today.
Indeed. Great segue.
No, I thought, so today and the next episode, which will come out in a fortnight, which will be on the 29th, I think, of October. So it'll be like right near Halloween. Both episodes are going to have some spooky topics to help us bring in the wonderful time of year that is Halloween. And today we are talking about Satanism and the Church of Satan, but also the representation of Satanism in popular culture. Talking about the satanic panic, I'm sure we'll talk about.
A very pleasing set of syllables.
Yes, it's a lovely phrase, isn't it, for a very horrible thing.
Yeah, it's a lovely phrase purely from the point of view of saying the words.
Linguistically, it's lovely.
Linguistically, it's lovely, yes.
Historically, horrendous. But we'll talk about that. But yeah, so I thought it might be an interesting topic just because it's something that pops up a lot, particularly this time of year. In popular culture, we see it a lot, but I think it's widely misunderstood as a church, as an organization, but also as just general topics. And so, yeah, I thought it might be a fun one to do for today.
And dispel some myths.
Oh, we were talking before we started recording, and Alan was joking about how much I hate when people use the word myth like that. So thanks, Alan.
Yeah, I'm just gonna sit here.
This will be a cult favorite.
Oh, very good. Touche. I think this is going to be one of our themes, isn't it, throughout the series, is whenever we're discussing religion and popular culture, a cultic aspect will inevitably come in, and will today, and I'll get on my high horse, and myth always comes in some way, and you get on your high horse as well. Yes. Between us, we've got 2 very high horses.
We're riding very, very high.
Yeah, and we're probably going to have to set up special segments, or it's Alan's turn to rant about cults again.
Well, especially because our last episode, which was on Mary Cosby's may or may not exist cult from the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City. So I think it'll segue quite well into the conversation today, because we're going to be talking about essentially a lot of the issues that happen when people have the views of cults that we talked about in that episode. I think the Satanic Panic really shows a lot of the bad things that happen when people have those kinds of views. But we'll get there. We're getting ahead of ourselves already. As you can tell, we're very excited about talking about Satanism. Well, so I wanted to start with kind of doing just a really brief overview of the Church of Satan, and I mean that in an incredibly brief sense, because the Church of Satan is much more a political organization than it is a religious one. It's considered atheistic, so they don't pray to Satan as a god. They actually don't pray to any deity. They are atheistic. But they do a lot of moves in the US, and right now, in particular, they're doing some really amazing moves. As many people might know listening to this, America has made some standings. A lot of states have started to ban abortion, and the Church of Satan has started to sue certain states who have done these things in order to try to push for abortion to be legalized again. And so this is a lot of what they do. Most of the time what they're doing is they're pushing back against when there are breaches between the separation of church and state. So the United States in particular has a really bad habit of saying there's a separation between church and state. Religious beliefs should not influence the laws. And then Christian understandings will influence the laws, but all the other understandings are often ostracized. And so the Church of Satan will come in and say, hey, that's not okay. And they're always this really great standpoint for it because they scare a lot of Christians. So they're always this really great one for the evangelical understanding to kind of push back against that of having the Church of Satan. One of my favorite ones was when I was a bit younger. There was a courthouse somewhere in the United States, I can't remember where now, that erected a statue of the Ten Commandments on their courthouse property, that's a real bad one as far as the blurringness between church and state. And so they said something about how, well, any religion could build this as their kind of argument. And so the Church of Satan said that they should build a statue of Bahamut right next to it, which obviously caused a lot of issues, and so I think they ended up taking the statue down. So they are they're very successful a lot of the times.
Well, we'll return to the statue of Bahamut later on.
Yes. We'll be talking about that a lot. But yeah, so a lot of their focus, as far as their quote-unquote beliefs, will be, it's a focus on the expression of free will. So you have the choice to do things, and this is obviously comes back to when we're talking about, say, abortion, is that you have the choice to not do an abortion if you don't want to and you don't believe in it. That's perfectly fine, but also the choice should be available to people who do, because the belief for that is very religiously specific, and when you were talking about freedom of religion, that does mean all religions. So it's technically atheistic. So as I said before, so this whole understanding of them praying to the devil is a kind of an immediate misunderstanding of what they do. And like I said, they are very political. I think they're a lot more politically minded and prominent in that regard in the United States than they are in the UK, but they are present here in the UK.
Yeah, they're definitely far more US-based phenomenon.
Yes. I mean, yeah, they were formed in the US in the 60s, so they kind of have a lot more of that US basis, but they definitely are in the UK, and I think they're in a lot of other countries as well, so if this is something that interests you, go and seek out your local chapter. See what they're up to. But I think that most people would recognize Satanism in the way that both pop culture and colloquial conversations have painted it. And I think this is what brings us to the Satanic Panic, because in the 80s, in particularly in the United States, although it did also come to the UK as well, the Satanic Panic was massive. So I don't know if, Alan, you wanted to kind of give a brief summary for people, our younger listeners, and maybe those who this passed them by or they were in a different country. Can you summarize roughly what the Satanic Panic was?
Well, it goes in hand with the moral panic that I discussed in our last episode regarding cults in the 1980s. So this wasn't, in terms of moral panics, the Church of Satanism, or just the notion of Satanism in general, isn't unique. A conversation surrounding minority groups related to religion was prominent in those decades, particularly due to media sources. In fact, the media dominated those conversations. So accusations and testimonies from various minority movements, for want of a better term, were prominent at the time. And yes, Satanism was part of it. But it's as you were alluding to, Vivian, the one needing to explain to the younger listeners, it's something that has faded. And I believe I said in the last episode that I think that the term cult, in terms of popular cultural discourse, has shifted to go beyond minority religious groups to political/religious issues. At the moment, it's particularly prominent regarding the vaccine for COVID and the so-called cult of COVID, and these are, in my opinion, hybrids of political and religious issues. But however, back in the 1980s, yes, the Church of Satanism was in, or rather, Satanism in general was part of a moral panic that became known as the Satanic Panic, involving allegations of ritualistic abuse, sexual abuse, and obviously the really obvious one is worship of Satan. I think what I think is really interesting about the term Satanism in general is that it has a history beyond the Church of the 1960s. Satanism, as just as a term, has been present for centuries, and it's often been used as a counter to heresy or blasphemy. That if something was seen as being blasphemous or heretical, then the word Satanism would come in, often with very tenuous links to Satan. It was just seen as going against the grain, therefore it's clearly in Satan's purview, and it's pleasing to Satan because you are directing yourself away from God's light, shall we say. And then there was this transformation in the 1960s where the Church of Satanism is not alone in that a huge amount of new religious movements or minority movements, because of course some of these groups dispute their status as religion, which I think is really interesting. And the Church of Satanism certainly seems to these days, from what I see from their Twitter activity. Or maybe they don't. This is what fascinates me.
They're very fuzzy, and I think that's what makes them really interesting.
Yeah, and I think they do acknowledge that fuzziness. But they've got a very active Twitter presence, and they will not shy away from addressing the people who are criticizing them on Twitter. I think that's really interesting, and I imagine they would also certainly not put themselves alongside other minority movements that emerged at the same time, which I think is pretty interesting, because often as scholars of minority movements we tend to put these are the groups that emerged in the 1960s, but whether these groups would want to be presented alongside one another is a completely different story. I've diverted the conversation again, haven't I? I'm sorry.
No, I think it's all relevant. Particularly because I think when you were talking about kind of where Satanism falls in the kind of going against the grain, I think that's still prevalent and present in the way that the Church of Satan is viewed now. Even in their political things, they're often going against the kind of more mainstream cultural element of evangelical Christianity in order to say, no, actually, we're going to do things differently.
And in terms of going against the grain of evangelical Christianity, just the association with Satan, it's taking them to the other opposite end, distancing
Yes.
themselves as much as they possibly can from the evangelical church by saying, no, we're the church, is saying, the complete opposite side to God. Because of course it comes down to issues of good and evil as well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Which I suppose in evangelical circles would be presented as a very clear binary, but we know that isn't really the case.
Yes. But the Satanic Panic really influenced a lot in the US, in particular in the 80s and starting to go into the 90s. Even in like law enforcement, there was the production of what they called cult cops, which I'm sure is a phrase that you love, Alan.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, but yeah, working with the Cult Awareness Network.
But yeah, so they would go into, they would basically specialize in finding traces of Satanism in order to track down, in order to track down murders and, abuse and all that kind of stuff. And obviously there have been, as I'm sure many people would have reckoned from this conversation, there have been many false imprisonments based off of all of these actions. And one of the most famous is 3 teenage boys who were convicted due to of the murder of, I think, 3 or 4 small children, because they believed them to be Satanists when really they wore black T-shirts and liked heavy metal. And in fact, the reason that they had black T-shirts was used against them in court, because that clearly meant they were Satanists.
That's fascinating as well, isn't it? Because it's drawing a link between Satanism and rock and roll. And I know there's the cliche of rock and roll is the devil's music, which is why we love it. But, that, as you were saying, they were heavy metal fans, but clearly a link was made there just musically to Satanism that I think is absolutely fascinating.
Well, and I think that this also, this kind of brings us to other elements of it, of how much music in particular drew on Satanism, and heavy metal in particular. You have even some of the names would be drawn from, depictions of Lucifer and the idea of fallen angels. And I think, again, it's that level of disobedience. It's that level of going against the mainstream that they're kind of tapping into and wanting to position themselves so far outside of normality, quote unquote, that they say, well, I'll wear a pentagram on my shirt because that's my band.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, isn't it, that music, or, black T-shirts for, rock bands, were given an ideology. Not necessarily, as you were saying, these 3 teenagers were wearing black T-shirts, but thousands of people wear black T-shirts with bands on them. I do. But an ideology had been placed on them of Satanism because an association was made with rock music, which has its own stigma in the first place. It's just a really fascinating way of how these things come together.
Yes. So, I think that obviously, when we talk about representation in popular culture in the Satanic Panic, and outside of that, I think those kinds of elements, and particularly the way that mainstream culture viewed Satanism during that time frame, has really painted the representations of it in popular culture in the way that it's depicted in, say, heavy metal, which we've already kind of touched on, that kind of doubled down on it during the Satanic Panic of, oh, you really dislike this? Well, then I'm going to definitely keep doing this. And then you have, but also just elements in movies and television, you kind of drew on those aspects, that kind of idea of it being this really scary, outside of norm, witchcraft, not praising God level of conversation. And that's how Satanism was always depicted. But it's always kind of been that way. I think Paradise
Mm,
Sean Milnes,
yeah.
because it's a really old take on kind of Bible stories, but it has become such a defining idea for certain characters, and in particular in Satan, that most people's understandings of who Satan is as a character in religion actually comes from Paradise Lost and not the Bible, because Satan's not really that heavily present in the Bible. And when he is, he's seen as the adversary. In some cases, he's still part of God's entourage. And Job, he's just chilling with God. He's not ostracized. So, seeing things differently due to the prevalence of fan fiction.
Yeah. Well, absolutely.
But let's talk about representation in popular culture, and I think that there's one in particular that I wanted to focus on, and that is Netflix's The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. I think that's what they called it.
Yes,
Which
it
is
was.
the new take on Sabrina the Teenage Witch, which was a lovely show in the 90s that was like a sitcom.
Mm.
And in the 90s version, Satanism was not present at all. It might surprise you to know that a aiming for teenagers sitcom in the 1990s did not feature conversations about Satan.
No, I mean the differences between these two shows are radical. To
Yes.
the point where it's essentially totally different characters in totally different scenarios that happen to have the same names.
Yeah.
Um, it's have you seen The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina?
I've seen the first couple of episodes. My husband and I just couldn't really get into it. We didn't have anything against it at the time. I had some thoughts on their representation of Satanism, but I was able to look past that in order to watch a show. There was just always something that made it something else more appealing. So we never really kept watching, and I have heard that it doesn't really get much better.
No, actually, the opposite. It gets worse. Um, Obviously, my opinion. I'm sad to say because I really enjoyed the first season. I thought it was good fun. I think the cast are very good, and they remain good throughout. But things from season two onwards just started going off the rails in terms of coherency. As you were saying, the way certain rituals and practices are presented are quite strange, and fiction is fiction. You're going to create your own world and draw from real life examples and so on. I accept that. Um, the Satanism aspect is interesting. Partly, well, for two reasons. Firstly, the Dark Lord, Satan, is the character that is worshipped in the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. So there's a community of warlocks and witches who remain secret from, shall we call them the Muggles, um, of this world. And I think in that sense it's similar to the sitcom, isn't it? Because nobody knew Sabrina was a witch in the sitcom, did
Yeah.
they? Yeah, that's it. So they're practicing in secret, and the historical witch hunts are happened in this world as well, and that's why they're keeping themselves to themselves and so on. And they worship Satan, and the Dark Lord is the villain of the show. Sabrina herself is on a journey where she has to choose between light and darkness, and there's some tropes there that you've seen several times before. Making Satan the villain is interesting because, of course, her family are saying, "Oh, praise to the Dark Lord" and so on. Sabrina is expected to praise Satan, but she doesn't want to. And I know I'm getting hazy now because I haven't watched it in a while, but I think Satan was her father, or something like that. Anyway, side by side, that's a side note. The first thing I wanted to mention was Satan is, if we're looking at popular culture in general, almost the archetype villain.
Yeah.
Taken out of biblical religious context and placed into popular culture as a villain that everyone can recognize. And I'm particularly drawing from an article that I've got up on the screen that I sought out when I knew that we were going to be having this conversation today, by Kelly Wyman in 2004. The Devil We Already Know, Medieval Representations of a Powerless Satan in Modern American Cinema. And I thought the article was really interesting because they outline how Satan's defeated so much in pop culture that he isn't really a scary villain anymore. You associate Satan with a downfall at the end of a narrative. But regardless, Satan and images associated with Satan, whether it's the horns, the tail, the red skin, the hooves, there are, common categories that you associate with Satan are so immediately recognizable to audiences that he is still a compelling villain, even if he doesn't have necessarily the scariness that he may do. I guess this, of course, does depend on how good the writers and the cinematographers are, because a monster is a monster, and the way you present it is in its way. But I'm thinking of the end of Good Omens right now, where Satan turns up for what must be 10 seconds, and he looks exactly as you would imagine him. He's got wings, horns, and red skin, and so on. But it's immediately recognizable, and it's immediately recognizable as the archetype, the ultimate evil. So if you want to up the stakes, and they do this in The Exorcist, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
That Reagan is possessed in The Exorcist by a demon whose name I can't remember, but that demon claims to be Satan in the last third act of the film. In the end, the third act of the film, this demon claims to be Satan, and it's almost okay, we're going to up the stakes now. And we've kind of discussed on our other podcast what's interesting about that people should go and listen to, how anime shows often take things they up the ante to things are even more serious now than they were before, and picking Satan is almost that aspect of choosing a villain. We've got this really evil villain, how can we make them even more evil? Well, they're actually Satan, or they're working for Satan. So Satan can sometimes be a hidden character as well that is then revealed to be Satan, and of course the audience is so well aware of the concept of Satan that they think, okay, this is really serious now because this is the ultimate evil. So that was the first thing that I wanted to mention. And the second thing I wanted to mention, which I imagine you were going to bring up as well, Vivian, was the lawsuit between the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina and the Satanic Temple when the first season aired. Yes. Sorry, I'll let you riff on that for a bit.
No, go ahead. Because I didn't have it pulled up in front of me. I was actually trying to while you were talking, and then we've gotten too roped into what you were saying.
Well, I'll read from the BBC article that I have open on my screen. The Satanic
just real quick, we're gonna link both articles that you've talked about so far in the description if anyone's interested.
The Satanic Temple activist group is suing the makers of TV series The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina for $50 million over a statue. Interesting use of language already, isn't it? Over a statue. It's almost as if it's trivializing the case.
Mm-hmm.
So the accusation from the Satanic Temple is that their statue of Bahamut is nigh on identical to the statue used in the school of witches and warlocks in The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. And because the statues are both in a similar pose, they've got two children side by side staring up at a goat-headed demonic monster with wings. And it was eventually settled outside of court, I believe. The credits of the show now do credit the Satanic Temple for the use of the statue. Whether there was some sort of financial compensation or not in the end, I think the Satanic Temple kept to themselves. So already there was there was a conversation surrounding this show and Satan. But also it had already drawn into the idea of Satanism as well. And I don't know, just that first line of that article kind of shown how any sort of religion that doesn't fall into the world religions paradigm is inevitably trivialized one way
Mm-hmm.
or another. Um, and yes, I think they did settle an agreement at the end. And the article that I've got as well even mentions the incident that you referred to earlier, Vivian, with the erecting of the statue. Sorry, I've gone off
Yeah,
on another tangent.
no.
You carry on.
No. I think that it's a really good kind of conversation about this lawsuit because it does, like you say, it kind of helps to show how blurred the boundary line is for the Church of Satan when it comes to political existence that's atheistic, for a hyphen theistic, or whether it is very much more religiously oriented. And the fact that they sued, I think, really shows not only a conversation about its own placement in this dichotomy of religion versus secular organization, but it also has a really interesting conversation point about representation of religions that people inherently don't believe are real.
Mm.
And I think this is something that's really fascinating. And when I taught religion, I found a lot of students did not think that there were witches that existed. They didn't believe that there were pagans that existed. And as soon as you kind of start pointing out, no, actually, there's a group of people here who have really real beliefs to them, and they exist, and they deserve to have, rights and and opinions and their own beliefs respected. The conversation became very strange because they honestly did not believe that they were real. And I think that when you're writing a fun piece on a teenage witch, Satanism seems to be a fun point, and you might not really honestly believe that people would care. And I pick particularly pagans because I think pagans are equivalent to Satanists, but because they are often equated in popular culture. For example, we've been talking about a show about a witch who has been equated with Satanism.
Yes.
And no one bats an eye, but it's because it has been equated like that. But there are Wiccans and people who identify as witches who would not identify as Satanists. And that is worth having an honest conversation about. But again, there's probably lots of people who go, well, there aren't any witches. They're not real. What are you talking about? And I find that interesting.
No, I agree. So there's already an implicit understanding of what a witch is.
Yes.
And an implicit understanding of what Satanism is.
And it essentially ends up making it so people are blind to the existence, the real life presence of both.
And a lot of it comes down to language. That witch and Satanism and so on are used in such different ways and contexts in popular culture than they are outside of that. If you could say that there is an outside of popular culture, if we want to start blurring that even more. And I think a lot of these misconceptions are projected by popular culture.
Yes.
Media can really shape our worldviews. And I guess this is another thing that we come back to when we're saying that religion and popular culture are two sides of the same coin. Values can be taken from popular culture. Values can be taught through popular culture. And even if the audience don't necessarily realise that it's happening at the time. So if somebody has been raised on popular culture, particularly fantasy, and they've encountered witches, Satan, and so on, and they're not particularly religiously literate, for whatever reason, they may never have encountered the opportunity to learn about religion from this perspective, then it's almost inevitable that they would have this perception of them being one and the same. because it isn't unique to Sabrina.
Yeah.
I'm struggling to think of any examples right now, but I know that it's not unique to Sabrina.
Well, I mean, it happens a lot, I think, in general kind of stories about this kind of stuff, where you get, again, because of the history, so werewolves historically were also associated with Satanism. And I think that there's still this kind of idea of them being, quote unquote, cursed by a dark force, you know, even when they don't specifically mention it. There's all of these kinds of, that type of language that is always associated with the things that used to be part of the witch hunts. So yeah, again, I'm also stunningly blanking, but it's definitely, I think, heavily present in a lot of different circles, and the fact that we, and I say we as a more general culture rather than we as in me and you, would equate those. And I think the power of popular culture is the fact that it does take our worldview and replicate it, because it's being made by people who have these worldviews. But then because they exist, and they exist for so much longer than an individual, they end up being something that people then mirror. So popular culture itself ends up becoming a way of continuing a cycle of worldviews and understandings. And the only way to stop it would be to create new popular culture that purposefully breaks the cycle. And this has been done successfully with some views. And in particular, I'm thinking of the LGBT community. And as much as I disagree with RuPaul on many aspects, RuPaul's Drag Race has completely altered the perception of the LGBT community for a lot of people.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's not because people magically learned on their own. It was because the popular culture around them transformed the worldview.
Yes, the popular culture that they engage with recreationally.
Yes.
Can encourage a new view. And it really is testament to how we can take morals and values, but also what is quote unquote normal, because there's no such thing as normal. But it's often presented that there is. So if popular culture can present more progressive or accurate examples, like what you were saying about what RuPaul's done, it can present a new normal.
Do you think there would ever be an acceptance of a protagonist? Well, I guess there has been.
I have no idea.
Never mind. I realized that partway through saying this. But there have been examples of the devil as protagonist, and particularly the show Lucifer, right?
Which I keep meaning to watch.
I haven't seen, and unlike you, I keep meaning to watch. But from my understanding, though, it's that he's rejected his place as Lord of Underworld and is trying to live a normal life, which means that he's essentially rejecting Satan's position. Which I guess would mean that he can't technically still be Satan and a protagonist.
Well, the anti-hero is a very popular trope in current media, isn't it?
Yes, but I think there still has to be a representation of him as different. So, for example, in Lucifer, again, this is grain of salt. It would really help
if we'd seen this show.
I know, we're so talking out of our butts. But my understanding of it is that in order for him to work as a protagonist, he's still an anti-hero. He's still a bit of a you know,
a bad
womanizer. Boy. You know, he still kind of plays the role a little bit, but he is ultimately a quote-unquote good person that rejects the position of Satan, not because of what popular culture paints Satan to be, but because of what Satan actually is.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how you could, whether or not the world is ready. That sounds so ominous and over the top, and I don't mean it like that. But I don't know whether general culture would be ready for a conversation of someone saying, I embody what you think of Satanism as being, but not all at the same time. And it's still inherently quote-unquote good.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting question, isn't it? Because the thing with Satan as a character is, or as a figure, is that there are, there's centuries of notions of what Satan is.
Mm-hmm.
And a really well conceived idea of what Satanism is amongst general pop culture audiences. That it would take a heck of a lot for that to change.
Yeah.
But Satan is still going to be presented, generally speaking, as an evil entity, because that is how Satan is presented in so many religious movements. As an embodiment of everything bad.
That's fair.
I'm thinking out loud here.
No, and I think that, just from a historical perspective, there is something inherently, I don't want to say necessary, but I'm going to say necessary, about presenting things in those binaries. And how Christianity was complicated in the sense that it presented a triad rather than a binary. And it was very new at the time for doing that. But it ended up kind of over time falling back on the binary with the overuse of Satan as the antithesis, and kind of coming from it the perspective of Zoroastrianism, which came before, which had a very inherent binary system of the good versus the evil. And in some ways, Judaism has the binary system, but in theirs, it's not a good evil, it's an us versus them binary, which is different. But it's still a binary system. But I think that what made Christianity really interesting, and this is going into a more historical overview, but what I find really interesting about the history of the development of Christianity is that it shifted things from that binary system to a triad, whereby the us versus them stopped existing, because you could suddenly change. So in Judaism, you are either born Jewish or you're not. And you can convert, but you're still not going to be the born Jewish. And that, especially at the time when Christianity was popping up, that was definitely the viewpoint. That suddenly you have a religion going, no, you can convert, and you're just as much of God's chosen person. That you're not God's chosen person because of birth, you're God's chosen person because of who you are and what you believe in. And suddenly it developed into this understanding of a transitional period that you can do. There's a really interesting article by Seth Kunin called The Allegory of the Olive Tree, and I'll try to link it, that goes into this. And he continues it forward to then also talk about Mormonism and how Mormonism also follows a much more drawn-out triad. That then the American system is very similar to as well, but that's a whole other thing. But I do find it interesting that I always talked about this when I was teaching structuralism to students, and I would draw it with different Venn diagrams. So Judaism would have two circles that aren't touching, and Christianity suddenly had two circles that are touching, and how that structure of culture actually completely shifted. But what I find interesting about the Satan introduction to the conversation, to bring it back to what we're supposed to be talking about, it goes back to the no circles touching. You're either good or you're bad. You're either with Jesus or Satan. And it's a very interesting cultural shift. I don't know, that was me just ranting for a little bit.
No, that is really interesting. And those parallels that can be made.
Yes.
Yes, I am interesting.
I do have interesting thoughts, Alan.
Yeah, you do.
No, I mean, I think a lot of that comes from views of structuralism. And like I said, I'll link Seth Kunin's article where he explains it a lot better. And he does also use the Venn diagrams to explain it. And then he goes into the triad system of Mormonism, which is not related to Satanism. So we're not going to talk about it today. But yeah, so I think there's a lot that's really interesting about Satanism and its place in popular culture. And I don't think it's going away anytime soon. That's for sure. Nor, I think, should it. But maybe a more critical view when we are viewing things?
Yes, and I think that's a good rule of thumb for most things.
Yes.
If not all.
Not that we can't have fun. I mean, as like I said, I was up for watching Sabrina and having a bit of fun with it.
Yes.
Knowing these things.
Yes, it's not a show that you would watch expecting a rigorous analysis of how these groups have operated historically, or
I don't expect that from any TV show, Alan.
No, true. But it takes pre-existing concepts and plays with them in creative ways that can sometimes be a detriment to people outside of the show.
Yeah. And as you watch your horror movies this Halloween, I'm sure you'll start seeing a lot of the Satanism creep up. We've mentioned The Exorcist, had some. Rosemary's Baby is another one that is heavily Satan influenced. There's a lot. And there's a lot of cult ones as well.
Oh, yes, so many cult ones. And you know how I love working my way through those.
I mean, I think that was a pretty good overview of some conversations around Satanism.
I think so, yes, I agree.
So if anyone was interested in Alad's talk that was supposed to be on the 21st of September, Alad was not feeling well, so we decided to push it off. And it's going to be in December now because that's when we had free. So you've got plenty of time. You've got plenty of time to book your spots.
Yes, it's been a busy few weeks. Yes. Come and see me talk about Free Zone Scientology.
Which is not about Satanism.
Yeah. All online. And come and register. You can find the link through our website. That's alt-act.uk. You'll find the relevant links there. It'll be on December 7th, I believe. Yes. At 7:30 GMT. So do come along. It'll be a good chance for a good conversation about contemporary religious issues, using Free Zone Scientology as an example of exploring those issues. So
and I will link that also in the description for those of you interested.
And Vivian will be chairing it. Certainly.
I will be chairing it, so you can see our lovely faces as well as hear our lovely voices.
Yes,
and you can shoot us messages like, "You aren't how I pictured you."
Yeah, exactly. Wow, Alad, you're so handsome. Those sorts of messages. Maybe one day.
But if they want to talk to you about Satanism, Alad, where can they go?
Oh yes, come to my Twitter page at AladJLL Thomas. You'll find me on there, and we can talk all manners of religion and popular culture.
Yeah, and you can also you can hit me up on Twitter, Instagram, and or TikTok at Vivian Asimos on all three platforms. And you can also go to my website, incidentalmythology.com. Speaking of which, I have received a couple of emails from listeners through my website at Incidental Mythology who wanted to talk about the show in more than 250 characters. If you are like that, go ahead and send us an email at incidentalmythology@gmail.com, and maybe next episode I'll pull at least one or two of the ones that we got, and maybe Alan and I will chat about some of the questions and stuff.
That'd be really cool.
So yeah, if you've got any questions and stuff, shoot them over.
Pew pew.
Whoop whoop. Anyway, I'm excited about spooky season, and I'm excited about the next spooky thing.
Yes, let's keep the spook train going. That's the train you can hear outside Vivian's home.
Yes, they're ghost trains.
Yeah, they'll go away after October 31st.
Wouldn't that be nice? Yeah, so hopefully y'all have a lovely Halloween. Eat lots of pumpkin pies. Drink your pumpkin spice lattes.
I've never tried one.
Oh, Alan, you need to hang out with more basic people like me.
Yeah.